So thanks for coming out on a rainy night and to see Dick Metz continue his story and his history of relating to Laguna Beach for the Laguna Beach Historical Society. I'm the current president. We're all volunteers. We're a nonprofit, so if you become a member at $25 a year, it's a tax deduction. And we're always looking for docent volunteers. We have the little house down on Ocean Avenue that was built in the early 1920s, or 23 maybe. So I see a lot of community, heritage committee members, surfers, people who've contributed to Laguna. That's what makes tonight special, and Dick will learn more about his life in Laguna and beyond. So again, thanks for coming out on a rainy day. We're so happy to see a crowd. And I want to introduce someone who doesn't need a lot of introduction, Dick Metz.
The powers that be suggested I talk tonight about Hobie and the stores that have created and started really right here in Laguna, and also some of the businesses that I got into, not necessarily wanting to, but just did here around Laguna. So the last time we talked about life in Laguna before the war, and the war came along, of course, changed everything. You couldn't go to the beach, even had barbed wire on the main beach for a while. So surfing was out, and all the beach parties and everything we did was kind of worked down to nil. So I'm going to start tonight after the war. The war ended in 45, 46, guys start coming home. By then I was out of high school, going to college, and I went to, we didn't have Orange Coast then. Orange Coast was down, I don't think it started till about 1950 or so, but this was 47, 48, and a lot of Easter week people would come from San Bernardino and Ontario and Pomona down here to Laguna for Easter week, so we knew a lot of the girls from San Bernardino, and Chaffee had a college there. So a bunch of us, Johnny Hedges and a bunch of other Laguna guys, and I all decided to go to Chaffee College, which happened to be in Ontario, California, on the same campus that the high school, Chaffee High School, was on. Well, it just so happened to be, and of course, in those days we didn't know each other. Well, I met him, but Hobie grew up in Ontario and was 5 years younger than I was. He was a freshman in high school, and I was a freshman in college. So I actually met him, but he was just a young little kid going to high school and we didn't know that he could make surfboards, and he didn't know it either. So that was our first meeting. And a couple of years later, Hobie's dad bought a beach house on Oak Street and what's the name of that? Gaviota. And Hobie came down. By now, he was a couple years older, and I was surfing, and Walter Hoffman, a bunch of us at Oak Street and Brook Street, and he came over and said, I think I want to learn how to surf. Where can I get a surfboard? Well, in those days, there were no surf shops. You had to get a friend, or if you were good enough, to make one yourself, because there was just no play, there was no demand. Surfing up until then had no wetsuits. Boards were heavy. My first board weighed 109 pounds, had no fin on it. You could only surf it in Doheny, San Onofre, Palos Verdes, were a different kind of a wave. You couldn't ride it at Oak Street or Brook Street. So then balsa wood was discovered and came into being, and the English invented resin and fiberglass during the Second World War for an airplane that they made called the Mosquito Bomber. And they made it out of balsa wood to make it lighter, but balsa wood has no integrity, and so they had to invent fiberglass and resin to wrap the balsa wood in to make the airplane fly. And so once it did, two of Laguna guys, Burrhead and Hammerhead were their two nicknames, and they were aeronautical engineers at Douglas Aircraft in Long Beach, and they got scraps of resin and fiberglass from England and put it on. They didn't have enough to do their whole board, they just put it on the nose and the tail blocks. I have both their boards in the museum at San Clemente, so if you wanted to see them, we've got them. I got Hobie's first board too. So anyway, just kind of give you a little background on how all this started. So Hobie came down, he wanted to go surfing, and Walter said, well, you got to go to LA and buy some balsa wood. and then we'll show you how to fiberglass it. So he did, and he came down to his dad's garage right on Gaviota and started making a surfboard for himself. He didn't like the first one, so I have that in the museum. He made his second one, and he liked that better, so he was, like so many guys, out on Oak Street and Thalia Street trying to learn to surf. He didn't have a clue, and you just got to get in the water and go for it. So that was the beginning of Hobie becoming such a creative, inventive mind that he did have. He didn't go to college, went one semester at Chaffee, but he lived and came down here and stayed here, and he liked surfing, and he was really good with his hands, building stuff. So he started making a few surfboards in his dad's garage right there in Gaviota, and so guys would come down and order a board, and Hobie made, he and I talked about it a dozen times. We think he made 88 boards from 1950 to 1954 in his dad's garage. None of them had a logo, none of them had a number on them. He just made them and sold them to guys that had prepaid for them, and that was it. So by 1954, his dad realized that he had a talent, and he went down to Dana Point, which was not even a town then. There wasn't a fire department, a post office. There was only an Arco station, a little Mexican restaurant, and a motel, and maybe 5 or 6 houses. There was absolutely nothing in Dana Point. So his dad knew that we were making a mess and making noise, and so he built a 2-car garage, 20 by 20, with a lift-up door, like everybody has in their regular 2-car garage, and that became the first Hobie shop in Dana Point on PCH. And it was our clubhouse, because Hobie went down there, and he went to work. He married Sharon, who I thought she might even be here tonight, but that's the mother of his 3 kids, Jeff, Hobie Jr., and Paula. And so Hobie kind of had to go to work, and the rest of us really didn't. We were just surfing every day, but that became our clubhouse. And, you know, life is so different now, and it was not only different in a cultural way, but we had all grown up in the Depression, and money was kind of non-existent, and we made a way to get through life in the Depression with your wits and scamming a little bit. We were pretty honest, but it was all how you're going to get through life. We never thought about making money. It was so far removed from our head about having a new car or having a house. That wasn't even in our conversation. So I'm going to college, and I think I was between a sophomore and junior year, and I was lifeguarding in the summertime. They only paid us on the weekends. Not during the week. We had the key to the lifeguard station. That was something you should remember, Dale, not to give out the keys, but we all had a key. And the original Lifeguard Tower that's still there now came from the Union gas station on Broadway. And when they moved it over, I watched them move it, put it right there in the foundation. And my dad's restaurant and bar, called The Broiler, was right in front of it. There, where all the lawn is now, used to be houses and businesses. And my dad had a restaurant and a bar right there. So I literally grew up when I was 2 years old or whatever I was. My dad had put me in a little playpen out on the beach right by the Lifeguard Tower. Well, I want to tell you, it used to be 3 stories. And the city was a little slow. There's no city guys there, but they were a little slow in realizing that the ground floor, basically like it is today, you went up the ladder to the, oh, thank you, I have a drink. The second floor was only about 6 feet. It couldn't stand up tall, but there was no windows in it. Then another little step ladder went to the top floor where you could look out at the beach. Well, because we had a captain of lifeguards, but there was no city control, and they paid us, but it was, I think, 80 cents an hour, and only on weekends or holidays. So the rest of the time, we'd hang out there. It was our clubhouse. We had the key to the place, and so if somebody needed help in the water, we'd go help them. But we didn't get paid for it, so we just kind of made that our clubhouse. But this middle floor, the second floor, was the key to it, because we had the key, and when everybody would go away at night, we'd go back in and have a party in the lifeguard station on the second floor, because there was no lights showing out, there was no windows, and that was our place to play. And so, you know, you're a lifeguard, the girls are around, you're inviting them to the party, and as soon as the sun goes down, we'll open up the Lifeguard Tower and get up to the second floor, and we'd have a party. We usually have a jug of wine up there or something, and start things going. So the city didn't learn about this. This went on for a couple of years, and we used to have toga parties. We had excuses for all kinds of parties on that second floor. And so finally, the city got wind of it, and they had a guy named Carl Mays, a big, lanky, tall guy, kind of wobbled, and he wasn't very well coordinated. He'd never been in the ocean, didn't know anything about lifeguarding or swimming or surfing, but he drove the ambulance for the city, and he parked it right at Ocean Avenue, which, see, Ocean Avenue, the walkway that went to the beach, because the buildings were all along there, you could only get to the main beach by the Hotel Laguna or at Ocean Avenue, which was a great big wide sidewalk to the beach, or down at Broadway you could get in. So the buildings were all along there. So Carl, he drove the ambulance, and the city, because he was older than we were, made him in charge of the lifeguard service. But he didn't know anything about it and really didn't care. He didn't get paid any extra. So he'd come down occasionally to see how we were doing, but he was never there at night when we were having a toga party on the second floor, which was a good thing because he might have ratted on us. But anyway, we got going there, and one day I was telling Dale Geary a few minutes ago, but the Fullerton swim team at Fullerton College had won the national swimming championship. And they were all 6'2" or 3", big feet, big hands, and they came down one day, and we were all hanging out there because that's just where we hung out, is our clubhouse. And they said, well, it was like in May or something, and they said, we want to try out for Laguna Lifeguard Service. And we said, well, there's no tryouts, we don't need any lifeguards anyway. And we knew these guys, just looking at them, they could swim better than we could. And so they said, well, no, we're serious, we want to have a lifeguard tryouts. And I said, well, we don't have them. We're already lifeguards. We got enough of them. And so about that time, old Carl, he comes up from the ambulance, and he walks in there. His arms are about down to his knees. And he sees these new guys, and of course he knew who we were. And they come up to him and say, are you in charge? And he wasn't sure he wanted to say yes or not. And he kind of shook his head and, yeah, what's going on with you boys? He said, well, we're from Fullerton. We want all these medals, and we want to be a lifeguard here in Laguna. We want to be in the contest. And Carl said, well, gee whiz, we didn't know about it. He's hemming and hawing and walking around looking at the floor. He didn't want to look at them or didn't want to look at us. And he wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he's thinking about it. And finally said, all right, boys. He took charge, finally. He didn't know how he's going to do it. He said, all right, boys, I want everybody to stand up. Stand at attention. Get in the line here. And so all the Laguna guys stood up and we're shoulder to shoulder. We're poking each other. What's he going to do? This is going to be weird because he didn't know what he was going to do either. We knew he didn't know. And so finally he said, all right, he said, everybody that grew up and went to kindergarten in Laguna, take one step forward. So all of us took one step forward. And he said, you boys are hired as permanent lifeguards. And these Fullerton guys started yelling, what do you mean? How do you know they can swim? They don't know anything about it. We're better swimmers and all this. And Carl looked around, he looked at everybody, and he stood up there and he said, these boys have local knowledge. And he was right. We knew Woods Cove, Divers Cove, where the rocks were. We knew where all the abs were, too. And so we were hired, and the Fullerton guys ran off, and that was the end of that. So there were just a million little stories I could tell that through my life, I was just seemed to be in the right place at the right time. So a couple of years later, Hobie's down here. It's around 1950. I think I was a sophomore in college the summer before I was a junior. And we'd all, as lifeguards, we'd lay in the sand most of the time in a big circle. We'd smooth out the sand, and that would be our little chalkboard. We'd play games, who's going to get in the water first, and you got to back in on your hands and knees, and all these little sand games we'd play. And so I said, guys, this time it's really serious. I said, I cleaned off the sand, and we're about 8 or 10 of us in a circle. And I said, I've got to come up with a major next year in September in college. I have no idea what I want to be. I've not a clue. And everybody said, well, yeah, it's a problem. We make a list, doctor, lawyer, Indian chief, engineer, whatever, then cross them out. We had Peanuts Larson, who was another great Laguna character that I could talk all night on, Peanuts and Hems McClellan, but he always looked at things totally different. And he said, no, you're going about it all wrong. He said, what you want to do is make a real short list that says absolutely, no kidding, what you don't want to do. And then you get a lot shorter list than what you maybe want to do. So we look around at each other, and that sounds pretty good. So let's make the short list. And so Peanuts was the first one to say, number one, we put number one in the sand. He said, you don't want to ever have to wear a coat and tie. Well, now, we never had a coat and tie anyway at that stage of our life, and we knew we didn't want to wear one. So, yeah, we all voted, okay, no coat and tie, number one. And number two, and then we were all thinking, and I said, well, I grew up right here in Laguna like the rest of you did, and when I went to high school, we could go barefooted. We never had to wear shoes to school in Laguna, and sometimes you'd wear flip-flops or something, but didn't have to. And I don't want to ever have to have hard old leather shoes. I'm just looking around. I don't see a lot of hard leather shoes here either. But so number two, everybody agreed, no hard leather shoes, no coat and tie. And so then we're thinking, okay, for sure, is there anything else you don't want to do? Well, somebody piped up and said, well, for sure, you don't want to work on the inland side of the Coast Highway. The Coast Highway is only about 100 feet from where we were laying. And so with those three parameters, and this is what's funny about this story to me, is that we stuck to it. This is what really happened. So we started thinking, well, what can you do if you're going to live on this side, not have a coat and tie or hard shoes? We could come up with four things. You could be a fisherman, you could be a lifeguard, which we already were, you could make surfboards, which Hobie said, I'm going to keep making surfboards, and you could be a fisherman. And so, I was making surfboards with Hobie, working for him part-time, and I was tending bar on the ocean side of the highway, the Sandpiper. So, we were kind of covered. And to this day, we did have some Hobie shops that were on the inland side of the highway, but they weren't too far inland. And by and large, all of us in that group pretty much stuck to that the rest of our lives. I've never had a coat and tie. I've never had hard leather shoes, and I'm not getting it at this late date in my life, for sure. So that really set the tone of how we lived. It just started out that way, and it worked. So in 1954, then Hobie's dad realized that his kid had some talent, went to Dana Point, built this garage that I spoke about earlier, and that became our hangout. And we'd always go down there and on the way to the beach surfing, and if it got blown out, we'd come back and drink some beer, and I'd patch surfboards and just hang out. That was our clubhouse. So in 1956, a couple of years later, my dad had the restaurant and bar, but he bought a liquor store in Huntington Beach. And I forget the name of it, but the first thing my dad said to me, you've had 7 years of college, and by then I'd gone to college. I had gone in the Korean War. I had the GI Bill. So I went to graduate school in Mexico, which I wanted to travel, and I did that for one semester. I went to Honolulu graduate school, and I didn't go to school to learn anything. I never intended. It was never a fact that you went there you got a degree, but it wasn't. It was to be there. That's where the girls were, Willie Sutton said once, why do you rob banks? He says, that's where the money is. Well, we used to say, where are the girls? They were in college. So we went to college to find all the girls that came to Easter week at Laguna. So I'd done that, and I'd gone to school and done all this stuff and been to the war. And my dad said, well, with all this education, you ought to be able to run that liquor store with no problem. It was right on the Coast Highway, right across from the pier in Huntington Beach. So I didn't want to, but I thought, well, I might learn something up there and go do that. It's right across the street from pretty good surf. So I took it on, and I changed the name. I forget what the name was, but I called it Surf Liquors, of course. And so I had employees, and I'd set up the bank and the cash register in the morning, and then the morning would come along and the girls would come to work, the other employees, and I would take my board, which is in the liquor store, walk across the street and paddle out to the second tee in the Huntington Pier and surf. And these salesmen from the liquor companies, Young Market and Western, they came down with a briefcase, and they got to come, and I'm not at the store, I'm out in the water. So they had a little flag. The girl would raise the flag at the store and tell me there's a salesman here. And if they wanted to talk to me, they had to walk out on the second tee to the pier. And that didn't make a lot of points with them. They're on a coat and tie and a briefcase. And you know, the pier's got dead fish on it. They're coming out there. And I would be surfing. They'd look down and say, "Hey, Dick, we got a special on Jim Beam. $5 a case on 3 cases," or whatever the deal was. And I'd say, "That sounds like a good deal. Let me think about it. I'll catch another wave and I'll be thinking about it." So I'd ride a wave and the guy's thumping his foot and he's all irked about what I'm doing. Finally, I'd come back, "Hey, okay, I'll have 3 cases of Jim Beam or vodka," or whatever it was. But that's the way I ran it. Well, I wasn't running it, but I didn't know it right away. And my girlfriend, we'd go to Tijuana for the weekend, go to bullfights and get in trouble, and we got in jail one time. You know, every time I would leave, the store would either get robbed, stuck up, or a car would drive in, and something would happen. And I'd come back Monday, and it was a disaster. And my dad was getting more worked up and more worked up every day. And so finally, the mortgage payment, I couldn't make the mortgage payment. Young's Market wouldn't ship me COD. They did make it COD. I wouldn't ship me open invoice. And all of a sudden, it started to sinking in. Hey, this thing is going down the tubes, and it's going down pretty fast. So I fired everybody. I bought an army cot. I moved in the back of the liquor store and ate bologna sandwiches 3 meals a day. I never left the store from 7 in the morning till 11 at night. And during slow times, some of you older guys might remember magazines called True and Argosy. And this is long before Playboy or Esquire. And they're called men's adventure magazines. And they were kind of like, they'd tell stories, they'd say, bare-breasted maidens of the South Pacific. Well, that turned me on, baby. I'm ready for that. Anything to get out of this store. And so I'm reading all these articles, and God, I'm getting all hyped up. I got to get out of here. But, I owed a bunch of money, and I was responsible for it. We were always responsible, I think, in a general way, but we were trying to scam through it in an easier way than it was meant to be. So luck was on my side. Disneyland was building Disneyland, or Disney was building Disneyland in Anaheim. They had to have a liquor license. And there's only so many issued per county depending on the population. I let it be known, Surf Liquors is up for sale, and Disneyland came down, and I haggled with them over a couple of weeks, and I knew how much money. I had to pay the mortgage, and I had to pay all the old liquor bills, so I squeezed enough out of them to pay just that. I paid the liquor bills, the mortgage payment, everybody was off the hook, and I'd been working for no wages, bologna sandwiches, what I worked for, and I had $2,100 left. So with that $2,100, this liquor license went away. I'm back down at Laguna, and Hobie by now has realized that balsa wood, which boards were all made out of then, was running out. There was only grown in Bolivia, and there was only so much of it, and surfing was becoming way more popular, and young girls were starting to surf, and younger kids. Balsa boards came from 100 pounds, redwood boards, to down to 35 or 40 pounds, and people had more recreation time. The 6-day work week went to the 5-day work week, so everybody had 2 days off. So surfing was just starting to explode, and Hobie couldn't get enough balsa wood to make enough boards. So he, like a couple other guys, were trying to figure out what's the new material. So he started playing with styrofoam. And styrofoam, it's real soft and it's big cell. You can't work a tool with it, it tears too much. It's just too soft. And so Hobie bought a little chemistry set, and he lived on Pearl Street right in back of, there used to be a bar. One corner is the Spigot liquor store. The other corner used to be a bar called the Seahorse. And Hobie was the next house up. My dad lived on the other side of the street. And I, of course, long since moved out. But I'd go to my dad's house on dinner. Once in a while, they'd invite me over for dinner. And it was higher on one side. I could look down, and I'd go see Hobie all the time at night. But he had 3 kids he had to take care of. He had this chemistry set. He'd put the kids to bed, and he'd come up with different chemicals and make foam. And trying to make styrofoam into a smaller cell, more hard, so you could work with it, a tool. And so he played with it, and he bought a case of cardboard cartons you'd buy ice cream in. And he would label each one, the date and the components of the chemicals on that. And then the next morning, we'd go down to Dana Point, and the store at Dana Point that his dad had built, a garage, was a flat roof. And he'd put these canisters on the flat roof in the sun to see how the sun impacted the foam. And every day he'd get up on the roof with a clipboard, and number 2 was getting brown, and number 3 was really hard. And he kept watching every one of these things. And we didn't know, and he didn't know, but Hobie, he was really just savvy. He knew how to make stuff, and he was creative. And to me, he was a Thomas Edison of his era. And so finally, he got the foam, so it was almost done. He made a big mold, and we had a secret shop right here in Laguna Canyon where the Sawdust Festival is now. And we called it the Skunk Works, and nobody knew where it was but Hobie, myself, and Gordon Clark, whose nickname was Grubby Clark. And so the 3 of us would go down to this plant and play with the foam in a big cement mold that Hobie had made. And it weighed 500 pounds. We had to have a block and tackle to even raise the lid. And at the time, we would mix the different components of chemicals. And we didn't, we're kids, we didn't know anything. So we took an old drill press that you'd have in a wood shop class. Instead of a drill bit in the drill press, we put an egg beater in there. We'd pour all the chemicals in a bucket, and I'd hold it with one hand, lower the egg beater in there, and it'd swish around. But it mixed it up, but it didn't really mix it up as completely as it should. And then I'd pour it out in the mold. By the time I start at one end to get to the other end, it would be like trying to make a waffle when it didn't cover the whole thing, and it wouldn't quite go to the end. You didn't have enough dough or something. Well, we didn't know the reason. We had enough dough of stuff, but the humidity and the temperature was changing, and the canyon gets cold in the wintertime, and it would change every hour. And we didn't understand that, and every time we'd pour it, it'd leave a big hole, or the nose wouldn't get finished or something. But it was expensive. We couldn't afford to throw them away. So we patched all these blanks with Bondo. And so there was a blank, a surfboard blank, and it would have these big blotches in it, which looked terrible. So we had to color the boards. And it's not paint you cover them with, you cover them with pigment. Pigment's expensive and it's heavier. So it made the boards heavier, and we called them Easter egg boards. We had 3 colors, kind of an off red, a little light blue, and a white. And so you could order a new foam board, Easter egg, 3 colors. I think they were 65 or 70 bucks at the time. And that was the choice, but we had no other choice. So Hobie got really disgusted. Actually, yeah, this picture is Dale Velzy and myself. Velzy was a real good friend. We were all friends. We knew all the competition. We grew up surfing together. Velzy grew up in Manhattan Beach. Actually, he made my first new board I bought from him. He shaped it under the Manhattan Pier. He didn't have a shop. He didn't even have a garage. He just shaped it wherever he happened to be. And I paid $45 for a new board from him in 1949. This was before Hobie got started. My second new board, I had to go to Santa Monica and get a guy named Matt Kivlin, and he made it in the parking lot of the Sip and Surf bar. And so you'd order a board, and it maybe take 3 months to get a new, but they didn't work on it all day. They had jobs or going to school. They'd work a little bit on it. So the whole thing, they couldn't get enough balsa wood. So the foam was really critical, and Hobie was frustrated. He tried to sell it to Velzy. Velzy wouldn't buy it. He called it Flexi Flyers, and he would put little ads in the paper about it wasn't going to work. And so Hobie got mad one day, and Grubby and I and Hobie, and finally Hobie said, Grubby, I'll give you the phone company. You go do it. And Grubby had graduated from Pomona College. He's a smart kid. And he said, okay. And Hobie said, you call it Clark Phone, call it whatever you want. But the deal is, you don't have to pay me for it. It's free, except you got to sell me every blank $1 cheaper than you sell everybody else. Well, Grubby wasn't an idiot, so he just raised all the prices $1. That covered the price of the thing. But Hobie still got him $1 cheaper than everybody else. So he had a little bit more margin. Well, we didn't even know about margin, but we started figuring this stuff out. So that's what started the Clark Phone, and in that little shop. So I was the first employee there. I'd sold the liquor store, and I was getting ready to go around the world. I'm not going to talk about the around the world trip. I was gone 3 years. I left Laguna hitchhiking in front of the Sandpiper in 1958, hitchhiked to Panama. I never flew anywhere. I didn't have enough money to fly. I worked on ships from Panama to Tahiti. I got to the South Sea, saw a lot of naked girls, which pleased me immensely. Went on to Australia and surfed there. I went around the world, Africa, all over the world. Finally came home in 1961. When I got home, I told Bruce Brown, he was a movie guy then, and this is when Dana Point became known as the Dana Point Mafia. So Hobie was making surfboards, Bruce Brown was making surf films, and in the movies he would use Hobie surfboards, and John Severson, who was a school teacher in San Clemente, started Surfer Magazine, and he would use Hobie surfboard. We were all friends. We were going out together, double dating and partying together, so we were all, knew each other so well. So the guys, Greg Knoll, Bing, Dewey Weber, the guys at South Bay were envious of us because this is where the stuff was in Dana Point, and they started calling us the Dana Point Mafia. And so, unbeknownst to Greg, and they were all doing well. And we were friendly, but still competitors. And so Greg was doing well. He had a new building that he rented, and he had never worn a coat and tie in his life, and he invited the LA Times to come to the grand opening of his new factory, and his mistake was that he called, I mentioned Hevs McClellan. There's a picture over there. Some of you old-timers in Laguna might remember Hevs, but he grew up here, a lifeguard for many years, a real character. He was my business partner, ran the Spigot Liquor Store, which I owned, and we had a great time together, a great guy. So he was a real outgoing, talkative, fun guy, making jokes about everything. So Greg Knoll knew Hevs McClellan, called him to be the master of ceremonies at this grand opening. And all the other manufacturers in South Bay were invited, but not us, Dana Point. So Hevs, of course, tipped me off. He called me up and he said, I just got a job. Greg's paying me $100 to come up and be the master of ceremonies. And I just wanted to know they're having a big formal dinner. They're all in suits and ties. They're going to have the LA Times is going to be there. So I thought I'd give you a tip-off. Well, so once I told Hobie and Mickey Munoz and the Pattersons and all the guys working at Hobie's, right away we started growing little mustaches. We thought we'll go to the second-hand store and buy a coat and tie. And they were all old and we'd look like Mafia guys from Chicago in the 20s. And we had giant machine squirt guns we put in the violin case. So we got in the bus about 10 o'clock in front of the Hobie shop, and we had a keg of beer and I don't know how much booze in there. And we stopped at almost every bar on PCH from here to Manhattan Beach. And we didn't get there at 7 o'clock, and we were ripped, I'm telling you. It was a sight to be seen. So they'd already started the show. Hevs is up there talking to Greg, and Greg is in a coat and tie, and he's the last guy. Usually he's always conning somebody, putting somebody on, and Greg was a real screw-up. So we came bursting in there, and we had squirt guns. They had all this food laid out, big bowls of potato salad, macaroni salad, poo-poos of all kinds, and we started the biggest food fight in the world. They photographed the whole thing. We turned the table over. Mike Stang, Greg's best friend, is a good friend of mine, and he and I got in a wrestling match, and on the floor we tipped the table over. Anyway, that really broke up Greg's party, and he was so upset about it. The LA Times made a big joke about it because it really screwed it up. But that's where we carried on the reputation of the Dana Point Mafia. We wrecked his whole party. So it was a great story. So, I get carried away on these little side stories. I'm trying to go through on a yearly basis. So that was about that would have been about 1950, 60, one or two. Home from the trip around the world. And so I, those years, I got to look at all these different years. So that was about 1962. So I got home, and Hobie said, well, what are you going to do now that you're home? I said, I'm going to go back to Tenon Bar and surf all day. And he said, well, you don't want to do that. He said, I got to go to Hawaii next week. I want you to come with me. Because I had been to Hawaii, older than Hobie. I'd been to school over there. I'd lived there. I'd surfed there. And I knew all the local guys. I left my Matt Kivlin board with the local Beach Boys. And that was a great gift to them. And they really respected me for that. And so I was friends with all of them. So I took Hobie over there and introduced him to Rabbit K. Kai and Wada and Steamboat and all the local guys. He knew George Downey, who was his agent over there. And the reason Hobie wanted to go over there, he had given George the agency to sell Hobie boards in Hawaii and then send the order to Dana Point. He'd make the board, send it back to Honolulu, and George would get $10 for selling the board. Well, George wasn't a dummy either. He was a shrewd old Portuguese guy. So every order he'd get, he'd make the board himself and make $20 and never send an order to Hobie. And Hobie knew there should be some boards coming from Hawaii. So he and I went over there, and there was a bunch of George Downing boards on the beach, but no Hobie boards. So Hobie got really mad, and I was surfing every day because I wasn't involved in his business thing at that stage of the game. And he came down one day, and I was at Queen's surf spot, and he said, I just rented a store here. I want you to stay here and run the store, and I got to go back to Dana Point, so take me to the airport tomorrow morning. And I said, well, Hobie, I don't have any money. I don't know how to run a surfboard store. He said, well, you screwed up the liquor store. You ought to learn something on that deal. And so I said, well, you're right. I know where to start now with a little accounting. So we painted the walls that afternoon. Hobie made a Hobie sign. I have a picture of that, not here, but I have some pictures of that. And so the next day he said, I'll go home. You'll take me to the airport. I'll get home tomorrow. And he was making boards as fast as he could for other dealers. We had dealers. Sirs and Roebuck's was a dealer. And they'd send an order for 100 boards, and Hobie'd make 10 a week and give them to them. So he really stole the boards, finished boards that were going to Sears. He sent them air freight to me in Honolulu. So about 3 days later, I got 17 boards from air freight, and they came up. The store was on Kapiolani Boulevard, had a little lawn in front of it, and they put the boards out, dumped them on the lawn, and I put a sign in the window because the store was empty. I said, Hobie Surfboards coming soon. And all these little Hawaiian kids and Chinese kids were hanging out and looking in the window and no boards. And all of a sudden, here comes a truck with 17 of them. I opened them up. You open the box up, the surfboard would slide out on the grass, and they'd look at it. I didn't know whether it was the retail price or the wholesale price, and they're putting money in my shirt pocket. I sold all 17 of them in about 10 minutes. They never got in the store. They're all gone. And all of a sudden, I had $1,700. Of course, I owed Hobie. I had to pay rent on the store. And I only made $10 for selling a surfboard, so there wasn't a lot of margin. I learned about gross profit and net profit, big difference, And so I called Hobie. I said, I sold all 17 the first day. He said, well, I'll send you some more tomorrow. So he kept stealing some from, supposed to go to Sears and Roebuck, sending them to me, and I kept selling the boards like hotcakes, because here it was in Hawaii, and there was no place to buy a new surfboard. You could get occasion guys like George Downing to make one, but they had other jobs, and there was no shop. And this was the first ever retail store. We didn't make any boards in Honolulu's shop. They were just lined up. So eventually, it was a room about this size. On all 4 walls, I had boards standing up, and I had like 100 new boards, all different colors, sizes, and you could come in from an airplane on LA, come right in, buy a new surfboard, and be in the water in 15 minutes. And after you had it for 2 weeks on a vacation, bring it back to me, and I'd buy it back from you. So I got a bunch of used boards going. So this is how the industry started. I know this isn't so much fun, probably, unless you're interested in the industry, but this is what they gave me, the subject matter. So this is how the Surfboard Empire really began. And so I sold retail surfboards over there, and I called Hobie one day after about a month, because a lot of days I wouldn't sell a surfboard. The only other thing I had to sell was a Hobie logo or decal. A decal was 10 cents. So I'd ring out the register the other day. Maybe I had 30 cents. I sold 3 decals, no surfboard. I couldn't pay the rent with that. I said, Hobie, I gotta have other stuff. And he said, well, you know, other guys are making surfboard racks, and I'll get you some of those. And I said, well, send me some Hobie t-shirts. So he sent over half a dozen Hobie t-shirts, said Hobie, big Hobie on the back, and right below it said Dana Point, California. And I looked at that and I called him back. I said, Hobie, this Dana Point, nobody wants Dana Point. Do you care if I put instead of Dana Point, Honolulu, Hawaii? No, I said, do whatever you want. Hobie and I never had a contract. I don't think we even shook hands. We were such good friends. He said 1,000 times to him, if it's good for you, it'll be good for me. And do what you want, except you don't own the name. And I knew that. So I went down to a silk screener and had him take off the Dana Point, California, and put Honolulu, Hawaii. I sold t-shirts by the hundreds and hundreds right out of the chute, because that meant to anybody that had them, when they'd be on the beach at Laguna or Dana Point or Hermosa Beach, they had been to Hawaii. If they had a Honolulu Hobie t-shirt, that was a little sign that you've been around, you're cool. And so I started pumping those out, and t-shirts in those days were $2.50. And I went down every night. I'd close the Hobie shop, and there was this was long before Chart House, and there were no chain of steak houses and all that. There was one guy in Honolulu that started the whole thing named Buzz. It was Buzz Steak and Lobster, and he had a little restaurant. A top sirloin steak was $2.50. So I traded Hobie t-shirts for top sirloin steaks. I don't know for how long, but the employees all wore them. That was a cool deal. And to this day, a t-shirt now is like 30 bucks. How much is a top sirloin in most places? Around 30 bucks. It's still the same price. So believe me, I don't work in dollars anymore. I work in t-shirts. So that was the beginning of the surf industry. Before, it was just a few little guys on the beach. So I opened another store called Surfline Hawaii, and there were no clothes. There was no Hang Ten, there was no OP, there was none of those hadn't started yet. And the trunks we had were made by MD and Taki, and just handmade trunks, but there were no clothes that surfers wanted to wear. So Duke Boyd was a local guy from Long Beach, and he copied, I think I told you the last time about MD trunk. He was a one-legged Chinese guy that was a tailor and made trunks for us in Makaha in the early 50s. And Duke Boyd took one of those trunks and had Doris Moore, who was a dressmaker in Long Beach, copy those trunks and make Hang Ten. So that's how Hang Ten started. At the same time, this is 1964, I started Surfline with another friend of mine, Dave Rockland, who is kind of like Hobie. He's a real creative guy. I'm not very creative. I'm better with the numbers and margins and all that stuff. I figured that out finally. I started the same thing. And Dave was a good surfer from Malibu and was living there, just married a Hawaiian girl named Keone. And he had a couple of kids, and he was working for the Navy in a coat and tie, and he hated it. He'd get off work at 4, come by the Hobie shop, we'd go surf. I'd go over there for dinner. And so one night we were having dinner, the kids had already been fed, and Keone had the sewing machine on a little round table. And Dave said, you know, he's we'd been surfing. I was still in wet trunks. He had changed to a pair of pajamas, flannel striped pajamas that he had canoeing, cut off at the knees and make shorts out of them, but had a little fly and a tie front like your pajamas did. So he was just wearing those as kind of Bermuda shorts. And he said, canoeing, if you go take these old flannel shorts or pajamas, go down to the wholesale house in Honolulu and buy an aloha print and make these out of aloha print instead of flannel, they'd make a neat trunk. And so she did that. She made about 3 pair of them sitting there while we're making dinner. And so Dave and I thought, what are we going to call it? Well, let's call the company Surfline Hawaii. And he drew little waves and on a cocktail napkin. We're just screwing around. And jams. We'll call them jams. I don't know if you remember jams, but we started making those in 1964 when Hang Ten came out. So those are the first 2 beachwear companies in the world that started making surf clothes. And so we also then took aloha shirts and reversed the print, turned it inside out so it was a little duller, and those were Surfline shirts, and we had the jams, and the company is still going today. Dave has passed away, but his son, Pua Rockland, runs the company, and it's still making jams. I got a new pair about a week ago, so I still get all my jam clothes and shirts, and so that was a company that started along with Hang Ten in the surfwear industry. And so then we started carrying, in the Hobie shop in Dana Point, they started carrying some Hang Ten trunks and some jams. And about this time, 1970, let's say it must have been about 1970, Hobie called me up again. He said, you got to come over here, and I'm making Hobie Cats, and I want you to see what I'm making, because I want you to be the Hobie Cat dealer for not only Hawaii, but the whole Pacific Ocean. I said, Hobie, I don't even know how to sail a catamaran. And he said, oh, it's really easy, no problem. So I said, on second thought, I will fly over to Honolulu next week. I'll bring numbers 7 and 11. We've only made 11 of them so far. I'll bring 2 over, and I want to test them in the heavier winds in Hawaii. So he landed at Honolulu Airport, and of course the airports weren't like they are now. They land on the tarmac, you walk down on steps to the tarmac and get your luggage someplace else. So they had the boats were in the boxes on the same plane. They let them off on the tarmac. And in the old days in Honolulu, the Pan Am clippers would land in the water, and then they'd come up on the tarmac. So we built the 2 Hobie Cats right where the slope was into the water. And Hobie said, well, let's sail them to the outrigger. I said, Hobie, I still don't know how to sail. He said, well, do what I do, follow me. So by the time we get there, you'll be a good sailor. Well, he was right. It took about 4 hours. Normally, you could do it in less than an hour if the wind was right. I tipped over 100 times. He showed me how to ride it. By the time we got the outrigger, I could sail it pretty good. And so for the next 6 months, I sold the Hobie Store to Jerry Lopez, you might remember that name, great surfer, Mr. Pipeline, and Jack Shipley. They bought the Hobie Store, but they couldn't use the Hobie name, so that's how Lightning Bolt Surfboards evolved. They had to come up with a new name, so it was Jerry Lopez and Lightning Bolt. So every one of these steps was increasing, growing the industry, whether it be surfboards, clothes, or something to do with the whole industry. So then I became the boat dealer. I did it out of the outrigger, didn't even need an office. I put them together there. I sold 122 boats to outrigger canoe members. We anchored them. I built a little anchorage right in front of the outrigger. And then I'd take them on a barge, the Young Brothers barge, to the different islands. I'd put 4 or 5 boats on a barge, and then I'd go over, a flyover, and I took my girlfriend, Shirley, I later married her, and we went to Kauai, and in Honolulu Bay, it's a great big bay, I'm sure some of you have been there, there's no waves inside that bay, and people have houses around it. So I put a Hobie Cat together, and I'm sailing around Shirley, and I'm sailing real close to the sand, hoping somebody's going to say, hey, what do you got? What kind of boat is that? And, get interested in it. And I get no calls. I said, Shirley, take off your top. Let's sail around again. See what kind of response we get. So she took off her top and we sailed around the thing. I sold 10 boats in about an hour and a half. So it shows you what merchandising can do. So then it was, so that was 68, 69, 70. So about 70, 71, Hobie called me and he said, you gotta come back over to Dana Point. I want you to, we're moving the factory from the garage on the Coast Highway down to Capitol Beach. I need more room. I want you to turn in the factory shop into a retail store, a Hobie shop. So by then I'd opened the store in Honolulu. The second Hobie shop I opened in Lahaina, Maui, was a little tiny store, had a dirt floor, little thatched roof over it. I put a carpet down on the dirt, and I hired a gal named Claire Smith to run it. And she was a good surfer, lived there, born in Lahaina. And I have a picture, it's over here at the wall, I think that's in there, of her holding her brand new baby, which was about 6 months old. And fast forward 30 years, so it was about, I don't know, 10 years ago, I was having lunch in Newport with some friends, and a bald-headed guy comes up to me and he said, are you Dick Metz? I said, yeah, who are you? And he said, I'm Claire Smith's son, the guy that's in that picture that you took of the baby. So that picture over there, she's holding a baby, was this guy. He just ran into him at a restaurant in Newport. But you never know where you're going to find him. But that store did well too. That was the second store. So the third retail store was the one in Dana Point. And so all of manufacturing went to Capitol Beach, and I turned that into just a retail store with boards and clothes. And then, let's see, right after that was 72. Then I opened Corona Del Mar, right next to the Port Theater, the next Hobie store. And I wanted one in Laguna, but I couldn't find the right location. So I'd go from Dana Point in the morning, I'd drive up, go into Corona Del Mar, and I'd stop at Laguna for lunch. And Forest Market was right there on Forest. I'd order a sandwich, and I'd take a clipboard and go out and sit on the bench and be watching people move around Laguna. So I would take a survey. I'd get up and I'd introduce myself. I said, I'm a college student taking a survey, and I want to know why you're walking on this side of the street, and where's your favorite store. And finally, I eliminated 5 locations in Laguna that I wanted. I didn't want any secondary ones. So I looked up to see who owned all 5 of those stores, and I called them all and said, I'd like to buy your store if you want to sell it, or rent it if you don't. And so, some of them had longer term leases. And so the one store where Glen Eyrie runs into Forest, it's about, where the Hobie Store is now on the corner. Well, the first Hobie Store was about 5 doors toward the ocean from that. Next to the science store, science religious store was there. I went to it. Science fiction was science. So I found out the owner was a guy named John Gilbert. So I said, John, I want to buy a store. I don't want to be paying rent. He said, oh, Dick, I'll make you a sweet deal. You'll love it. You'll be here forever. So I rented it from him, and for 10 years I paid him rent. And I kept telling him, if you don't sell this to me, I'm going to move. He said, you'll never move. This is a great location. Everybody knows where you are. So one day, sure enough, the guy that owned the store that we're now in, is Mark Christie here? Did he come in and I didn't see him? I don't think so. Anyway, Mark was an old friend, and his sister is married to Hobie's son, Jeff Alter, and Lori has the furniture store across the street from the Hobie Store in the corner there. So Mark, I called him up and I said, Mark, I just heard that the guy that owns the corner store, where the Hobie Store is now, just died, and he donated it to the Laguna Hospital. And I said, the hospital wants an x-ray machine or something. They don't want the damn store. Let's buy it. So Mark went to work, but we bought the store from the hospital where we are now. And it used to have 2 or 3 other stores. It was the hardware store was on the corner, and there was a little dress store, and another little store there was like 1,000 square feet. Of course, the Hobie Store has the whole thing now. It's about 8,000 feet, I think. But that's how I got that store. So I opened that store, and then this is a cute story, I think. I can think of so many funny stories, but I can't tell them all. I don't know how my time is. Karen, am I on time?
About 10 more
Oh yeah, you gotta close it up here. So anyway, so I'm having the Hobie Store, and I'd go over. The Union Bank was right next to. Well, I think it's a cleaners right now, but it was next to on Ocean Avenue. What's a store it was named? I can't think of it, but it was on Ocean Avenue, and it was the Union Bank, I'm sure it was Union Bank, and they had a commercial teller. So I'd get in line at the commercial teller, and the Stu Avis store, which some of you old timers will remember where that was, it's where the Candy Baron store is now. And Stu Avis had gotten old, and he sold that store to a guy named Earl Dawson. And I got to know him, and he didn't really compete with the Hobie Store. I mean, he had Aloha shirts, we had Aloha shirts, but he had white shirts and slacks and more of a dressy store, so we competed a little bit. But he was a kind of an uptight guy, and he was always in line at the bank like I was. And so I was always kidding him. I'd poke him and say, "Hey, Earl, did you have a good weekend over the 4th? Make a bunch of money, did you?" And he didn't like to talk about it. And he'd say, "Well, yeah, it was okay." And so we got to be kind of friends. And so one day we're there, and this went on for months. You know, I'm seeing him almost every morning. And I'd say, "Earl, how'd business going?" "Oh, it's going pretty good." But he never liked to talk too much about it. But one day he was really upset. And he said, "I'm madder than hell." And I said, "Well, what happened?" And he said, he said, "The damn landlord raised the rent on me." And he said, "But to tell the truth," he said, "I could do 2 sets of books. One's on percentage that I give the landlord, which is about half of what I really do. I keep the real books are mine. I pay income tax on those, but I don't pay rent on the full sales." And I said, "Well, whatever it takes, no problem." And so about a month later, I heard that the store was owned by some guy in Hollywood at the store that Earl Dawson in, the old store, and it's for sale. I called Mark. I said, "We got to buy that store." And I said, "When we buy it, put it in a blind trust, so there's no record of who owns it. It's in a blind trust." So we bought the store, put it in a blind trust. So a couple of weeks later, I'm over with old Dawson. He's in line again. I said, "How's business going, Earl?" And he said, "There's a damn new owner of this store. Some guy bought it up in L.A., and he said instead of paying percentage rent, he raised it to a flat rent." Well, I said, "Gee, is that so?" I told Mark, as soon as we got that store, he's making 2 sets of books. I said, "We're just going to raise the rent to a flat rent. Doesn't make a difference what kind of sales he does. We don't need to see the books. We just raise it." And he was cussing around, and he was such an uptight guy. I wanted to laugh and tell him so bad, but I was afraid he'd have a heart attack right there in the bank. And so the only reason I'm telling this story now is because he passed away a few years ago. So I figured it's safe to tell the story. But anyway, that's how all these things went. But there were so many funny things. All along, our whole deal was no coat and tie, no shoes. I went to work every day barefooted, pair of shorts. But it was always about having fun. It never seemed like work. We were passionate about what we were doing, and the passion drives you. I mean, you can have all the schooling you want. Now, in certain cases, Dr. Lawyer, you got to have that. But in most things, if you're stoked on it and you're passionate about it, you make it work because you just exude that passion. And that's the way selling surfboards to me, giving a guy, "Well, where are you going to surf?" "Okay, you want pulled in rails, you want a different shape, tell them what they want and sell them the clothes that they want to have." All of that was fun for me. It wasn't an effort, and I loved it. So that passion, I'm convinced, my education did no good for me. I didn't learn anything. I never got an A or a B in anything. I was always a C, maybe a C plus. So I graduated, but it didn't help me any. But the passion is what really helps you. So anyway, that was just one more step in all this. So I'm trying to think of let's see, I came to Hawaii, back over here, married Shirley. She was a really good athlete and used to play 2-man girl volleyball on the main beach with Nancy Creed, Pat Stubbs, and another girl named Pat Brady. And Pat Brady and Shirley were partners. And my wife was in Playboy, and she had a great figure. And in those days, bikinis, you bought, you girls will remember this, you bought an 8, a 10, or a 12. You didn't buy one at the bottom mix and match. You had to buy a set. And so in Shirley's case, she was an 8, fit her on the bottom, but the top was too small. And when she had dived for a ball in the sand, she'd kind of come out of her top. And so all the Laguna guys were sitting on the boardwalk waiting for her to come out. And Pat Brady, her partner, was getting bored with all the guys yelling at her and everything. I'd come down every now and then. They're all friends of mine. I couldn't, you know, I would have probably done the same thing if I wasn't my wife. So Pat said, well, I'm going to go home and make you a real top. And so she did. And a couple of days later, my wife and Pat, the Hobie stores were all men's clothes, beach stuff for men, shorts, you know, go-aheads, shirts and T-shirts and aloha shirts and whatever you need, and certainly surfboards and wetsuits and leashes and wax and everything for a surfboard. So Shirley and Pat Brady was her maiden name. She married Tom Lingo. Some of you old people might know Tom was a realtor here, and she married him and became Pat Lingo. But at that time, she was still Brady. Anyway, she came down to the Hobie shop with about 3 just tops, no bottom. And she said, Dick, you could sell these in the Hobie. I said, don't even think about it. This is a guy's store. And all the time, when guys would be coming in with their girlfriends, they'd drive in front of the Hobie store in Dana Point. The guy would get out, run in, buy a bar of wax or whatever he needed. The girl would stay in the car. She wouldn't even get out. There's nothing for her in the store. And then they'd go surf at Doheny or Cotton's or wherever they're going. And so finally I said, okay, I'll give you this little foot-long dowel, and you can put your tops on there. I'm not going to pay you till they're all sold, so don't even think about any money. This isn't going to work. This is the guy's store. And I couldn't believe it. Within 3 or 4 days, I'd sold all those tops. Every girl came in there. Now, the guy comes in, gets a bar of wax, he runs out, he wants to go surfing, and the girl, he's yelling at his girlfriend, let's go. Well, I got to try this on. So she spends an hour in the shop, and he's thumping his foot on the floorboards wanting to go surfing. The girl's in there shopping for tops. And so this is the beginning. See, this is how all these things develop. Up until then, you had to buy a size 8, 10, or 12 in a set of a bikini. Well, they weren't even bikinis then, like they are now. So I put in all these tops, and so the whole one room of the Hobie store in Dana Point, I made into a women's room. And that outsold, dollar-wise, the whole men's department. So that's why today's Hobie shops have both men's and women's. This was the evolution of the surf industry, how it grew. So it was just more fun because things were happening all the time. And to merchandise that, I used to sponsor, and I don't know if any of you here remember, but Smirnoff Vodka sponsored the U.S. Beach Volleyball Championship. It was at Manhattan Beach and Laguna Beach, the main beach, rope off all the courts and they'd have big Smirnoff vodka. And so to do my part, I had all our girls, and they were all cute little Laguna High School girls. I stenciled Hobie on the bottom of their bikinis, and I pictured them lined up on the boardwalk, 10 little bottles with all Hobie stenciled on the back. So that's the way we merchandised the bikinis. And I'm telling you, they sold like hotcakes, but the city shut it down because, well, it got crazy, and so on. But that's a whole nother story. We ought to have one session just for crazy stories, because I got a million of them that I can think of right now. So by then, I'm running out of time. They're going to get me out of here in a minute. So by then it was 1975 or 80. I opened a new store in Dana Point, so we had 2 stores. They changed the Coast Highway, so it was running down Del Prado and up on the Coast Highway. And the Hobie shop was originally on 2 sides of the Coast Highway. It's back to that now, but at that time it wasn't. And so I had to have the store on the other side, and that was called the Lantern Bay store. And so then I opened a store in Santa Monica, Laguna, opened that one. Then the other thing that came along, and some of you there again, old timers might remember Kathleen Martin was a 2 or 3 time mayor of Laguna Beach. I don't know if you remember her, but her husband was my best friend named Bill Blackburn. And so unbeknownst to most of my friends, OP came along, and all these beach companies, you know, they have to order colors and sizes a year before. They don't know what the stores are going to order exactly, but they've had a history of it, so you make your best guess. Well, you can order too many yellows, not enough blues, you know, too many 32s and not enough 34s, and so those become old, used inventory that they need to get rid of for dollars. So as OP got bigger, they had more of these. The more you order, the more carryover or rejects you're going to have. So stores would order too many, they'd send them back and get a credit for them. So Jim Jenks, he starts OP. He's a good pal of mine. So I know this. So I've been in the clothing business with Surfline and Jams. So I called Jenks up and I said, "What are you doing with all your seconds?" He said, "Well, to tell you the truth, Dick, I'm selling them out the back door of my factory, but I don't like anybody to know because I know you, and for one, because we were his biggest purchaser. I had 20 stores by then, and I didn't want him selling trunks on the beach where that's my big margin stuff." So I said, "Well, maybe what if I buy them all? I'll buy all your rejects, all your seconds." And he said, "Well, that'd be great. I'll pay you cash, I'll buy them, and I'll get rid of them. I don't want them sold along the beach, but I'll put one in Inland Oceanside." And so I had 3 stores, Oceanside, Irvine, and Anaheim. And I called these stores Team Deal. So in those days, if you were on the Hobie surf team, a good surfer, you got a discount in the Hobie stores for trunks or shirts or whatever else you're selling. And we called it the Team Deal. So a guy would come in off the beach and say, "I'm on the Hobie team, I want the Team Deal." And he got a discount for that, which was fine. So I called these stores the Team Deal. Nothing to do with Hobies. And so Blackburn, getting back to Kathleen, who was the mayor, and Bill, who was my good friend, he had been down to Oceanside and found this store I had, but he didn't know I had it. And he bought 3 pair of trunks at half price down there, but they had a couple of buttons missing or something was wrong with them. And he's in his Volkswagen van. He's driving up the Coast Highway, and there's not that much traffic in those days. He's hanging out the window. I'm sweeping the sidewalk in front of the store. And he swings by, and he's hanging these trunks out the window. He gives me the finger and said, "I'm never shopping here again. I can get a half price at Oceanside." I gave him the finger back, and I said, "I know it. I own that too." So I laughed, and he laughed, and we were great friends. He's a good guy. But anyway, I guess I got to end it. Well, I'm just warming up. But
Thank you for being willing. It's hard to imagine a time we didn't have surfwear and we didn't have all the surfboards available, and there were only 17. Thank you so much, and I want to thank Richard Kelly, our videographer back there, and Jane Jans, who coordinates our programs and is friends with Dick for our long term to bring this together. We have this on our YouTube channel, Laguna Beach the Laguna Beach Historical Society, and we have the one from February 28th last year, which goes over more childhood years growing up in Laguna Beach. So right now we do a question and answer, and if you put your mouth close to the mic, or you speak into the mic, it's better so Dick can hear, and then he can answer questions. I have one to start. Was there really wine coming out of the spigot on the Spigot Liquor Store?
Oh, I didn't even get to that, did I?
Is that yes or no?
There's all these segments. You asked me specifically about the spigot. When I started Surfline, the clothing company in Jams, I had to borrow $50,000 from the bank. And we didn't have any money. And the bank, I knew the bank manager, he was a surfer, shopped in the Hobie Store. He said, "The only way I'll lend you $50,000 is if you sign over the Hobie Store, all its inventory, and we'll give you a loan for 50 grand. So I did that, got the 50 grand, and Hevs, getting back to Hevs McClellan, there's a picture of him over there if you want to see what he looked like. A great big guy, weighed 300 pounds at one time. And but he was a funny guy. I like to roll on the floor. He'd do things that little kids do. He'd try and keep up with him, get his weight down. He could never do it, but he'd try all the time. And so Hevs is working he worked at Gill's Liquor on Broadway, and of course I'd worked at my dad's liquor store, and we had talks many times about when we really get grown up, what do we want to do? Well, let's own a liquor store. And so that was our dream. He's working in not at the Spigot, he's working at Gill's, and the guy that owns the Spigot is Jules Marine. He also owned the White House Cafe, and he bought that from Tom and Embry Bird. I know all these people all my life. Tom and Embry Bird, some of the oldest people in here, other than me, they used to have signs coming into Laguna, "Eat with the birds." And that was Tom and Embry Bird at the White House. They owned the White House, sold it to Jules Marine. It was a guy from New Orleans, and he was in the military. He got out discharged in San Diego, driving up to go to LAX to fly back to New Orleans, and he stopped in Laguna, and he never left. And he was always a dapper, dressed-up guy, wore a little pork pie hat, a funny guy. He really liked my dad, who had the bar here. There's only 3 bars in those days. My dad's bar, the White House, and the one on Ocean.
Marine Room.
And so, anyway, Jules Marine had the liquor store and the White House. And Hez and I used to bug him and say, well, when are you going to sell us the Spigot liquor store? He said, oh, you guys can't afford it. You don't know how to run it anyway. And Jules loved to drive. He had a big old black Cadillac, and he liked to drive. And he's the one that's all dressed up. He'd put Hez and I in the back seat, give us a bottle of wine, and say, let's go to San Diego for lunch. And he said, I'll drive, I'll buy lunch, and you guys can drink in the back seat. So he'd drive us all over. We'd drive out in the desert, and we're always working on him about the liquor store. So I've been to Hawaii, I've long since forgot about this, and Hez phones me up, and he said, I just talked to Jules again, he'll sell us the liquor store for 50 grand. And he said, have you got any money? And I said, yeah, about 400 bucks, and I owe 50 grand to the bank for Surfline. So I said, well, I've got about the same. He said, I don't know how we'll ever pull it off, but anyway, it's for sale, and he would like us to own it. So I started thinking about it. So Rockland, who was my partner, he wasn't my partner. I owned it, but he was really doing most of the work because I had the other Hobie stores to run. So I said to Dave, do you want to buy the part of the Surfline from me? He said, well, I'd like to, but I don't have any money. So there's a guy named Jimmy Fluter, who his dad owned all the car dealerships in Honolulu, and he was a good guy, and Dave and I both knew him. So he said, I'll buy half of it for $50,000. So he paid me the 50 grand. I still owed the bank the 50, but I took the 50 he paid me, and instead of calling Hez up and making a big deal about it, I wrote out the check for 50 grand, and it was about Christmas time. I put it in a Christmas card and mailed it to Hez. What I heard when he received the mail, he opened the Christmas card because he didn't know where it was from. He opened it up, and here was $50,000 in the Christmas card. And knowing Hez, he pulled out his shirt and jumped on the floor and rolled around, started laughing and ran out in the street and made a big deal about it. A couple of people were there, called and told me. So that's how we ended up getting the Spigot store. And Hez ran it for 11 months of the year. And my deal with him, I owned it, he ran it, and I would come over for a month so he could have a month's vacation and work it for a month so he could go off and screw around.
And I hear it's the oldest liquor store in Laguna
Yeah,
Beach.
in Laguna.
We have probably a lot of questions and answers, and we have about we go till 8:30, but we'll go over a little bit with those questions and answers from the audience. So we'll take those. Okay.
Hey, great evening. I have to ask you, how old are you? First question. Number 2 is, have you written a book? Because your evening is so great. Can we buy a book? Thank you.
Rick's laughing at that question, I'm sure. He's been asking me to write a book for a long time. Well, I've been lying about my age for so long. I always knock off 20 years because, I'm 94. And the reason I'm telling it now is because they made a movie about it the other day. And in the movie, it was made 2 years ago. I was 92. And I was going with this girl that was 61 or 2 or 3, I don't even know how old. And I told her I was 72. And so my mistake was having her go to the movie and it said I was 92. And she said, I can't go with somebody that's 92. I said, we've been going together for 6 months or whatever it was. She said, no, I just can't. I mean, nothing has changed, but my girlfriends, if they knew I was going with somebody 92, they would, they couldn't handle it. So she left me, and so I've been lying about it all my life. But now that it's in a movie, it's not a secret anymore. So I'm 94. A book hasn't been written, but I've done so many, this is my argument against it. Books aren't sold so well anymore, and I don't want to write one. It'd take too much time, and I got too many fun things to do. But Rick Balzer, sitting over here, has wrote a really neat book about Laguna. Laguna Kid is the name of his book, and the gal that helped him, he's put me in charge with her, and so we're talking about it. But every day there's something comes up like this talk, and every day I've got something to do, and I don't have time to do it. But maybe it's all there. It's been written. I've told stories. I've been interviewed for thousands of hours. And it's all been put from a tape recorder to written. So it would just take somebody like Rick's gal to kind of put it together in book form. But the trouble is, half of the stories are kind of X-rated. And I'm mixed up how today, when I grew up, all those four-letter words, you wouldn't dare say them. The teacher would whack you, and my mom would punch me out. Now you can say the four-letter words, but there's words I've been saying all my life that you can't say. I'm really confused how that works, but it's probably a good thing. So.
Anybody else? Any questions from the audience, or anything? Any stories? Anybody want? What about the spigot have wine coming out of it? No, you didn't. It didn't have real wine. Okay, that's a myth. That's a myth. Well, we hope maybe to have Dick come back again and show more photos and things. But thank you so much.